On our panel, here is Eric Ries, who is the producer, director, and actually I noticed your name about 10 times in the credits, so he did a lot. He's the man behind Drug Lord. Eric Ries has come from New Zealand as well to be here for the premiere, so thank you very much for that, Eric. Helen Barnacle, next to Eric Ries, is a clinical psychologist, and she's also had quite an experience with the drug war, and we'll get her to talk a little bit about that soon. Greg Chipp, welcome to the stage. Greg Chipp is the founder and director of Drug Law Reform, the Drug Law Reform Political Party, and also this one, which is a new charity, Drug Policy Australia, which will be looking to recruit members and make some changes in the way that drug policy happens in Australia. Greg Chipp. Next to Greg is Fiona Patten, the president of the Australian Sex Party and member of the Legislative Council for Victoria. And sitting next to Fiona is Greg Denham from Law Enforcement Against Prohibition and also works for Yarra Co-Health. A round of applause for our panel so far.
Thanks again for having me. I was really oblivious to all of these issues until I met Abe Gray, who you saw in the movie, the guy with the big beard, and I became intrigued at the level of police interest that was surrounding him, even though he was a very well-educated family man with a good job at the university, and the police had launched this massive campaign against him, including undercover operatives that they'd sent into the university to infiltrate this group of stoners, and they'd spent millions of dollars trying to arrest Abe, and when they finally arrested him with 2 grams of weed, after a long legal proceeding, the judge just saw the light of day and threw it out, and I thought, well, that's kind of a ridiculous waste of resources, and that's what started the entire project out, and it just ballooned from there and kind of has absorbed every aspect of my life since then, and that's me. Oh, and I'm making a sequel, which I'll tell you a bit more about later.
I inadvertently became involved in the drug world as a confused teenager. I ended up a heroin addict, and unfortunately they made a precedent with me and gave me a really, really long sentence. So in the late 70s here in Victoria, there were only 25 women in prison in Victoria, and today there's 411. And you'd see the same escalation in the men's system. So I spent nearly 8 years in prison. By the time I went to prison, I was pregnant and had a young child. So it became, I guess, a huge issue just because I was a heroin addict. I then became a criminal, and then my daughter missed out on the age between 4 and 8. She had to leave the prison. She stayed with me in the prison till age 4, and then she had to leave. So I didn't want to work in the drug and alcohol sector, and I didn't really want to talk about drugs ever again, but I keep getting dragged back in. And part of the problem, particularly here in Victoria, is we still don't have spent convictions legislation. So people become criminals and then they can't get a job and then they can't get back into society. So I suppose I'm one of the lucky ones. I lived as opposed to most of my friends who died. And so I talk about it whenever I can.
Thank you, Helen. Greg.
Hello. I became interested in drugs as a inquiring 14-year-old and brought my first matchbox of marijuana. And I guess what motivates me to get involved in a reform law movement almost 40 years later is the fact that it's still illegal. The marijuana is still prosecuted, people are locked up, their lives, and the movie we just watched really just makes me angry. So I guess I'm all about changing the laws, changing attitudes, because I think before we change laws we've got to change attitudes. So at the last election we formed a political party and stood on a platform of drug law reform. Subsequently we formed a charity called Drug Policy Australia, which is attempting to get to the root evil of the prohibition and change the laws by changing hearts of minds, lobbying the government, and trying to do the detail of what legislative changes are required. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. Fiona?
I think probably my first kind of interest in policy area was around the early 90s when HIV and AIDS was first on the scene, and our governments were grappling about what to do specifically for HIV spread amongst injecting drug users. And I was a volunteer with the AIDS Council. I used to work on one of the needle exchange buses, and I mean that was probably the last time that a government has made a sensible decision about drugs. And at that time, we were one of the very few countries that said, you know what, we need to minimise the harm here. We can keep telling people to not take drugs, but how about if we just give them clean needles and reduce the spread of HIV? And it was a very practical response. It was a harm minimisation response. It has been hugely successful. And we were leading the world at that time. Sadly, as I say, that was the last time they did anything sensible around drugs. So as many know, I formed the Australian Sex Party in 2009, again on a policy of drug law reform. I visited Portugal and met and spoke to many of the people at the coalface there about how their decriminalisation of drug use and possession had changed everything, and we certainly heard that in the film. And then last year I was elected to Parliament, so I've been able to campaign on drug law reform from within the Parliament. And just 2 weeks ago, I was successful in getting a committee inquiry up, which I'll speak about later, that is a very broad-based 18-month joint party committee to look at pretty much all aspects around drug laws, drug treatments, and what the rest of the world is doing.
Thank you, Fiona. And second, Greg.
Thanks, Nick. I guess, like other people on the panel, I've had a bit of a long journey, and I started as a cop a long time ago, and I spent a fair bit of time doing operational policing and did all the things that cops do. But I was very fortunate to have, I guess, I worked with people who were continually questioning, I guess, laws and policies, and particularly the impact of laws and policies on young people. And I started to question, why do we have laws that incriminate, incarcerate people who, just want to enjoy themselves? And most of the people that I dealt with were nice people. Jack Cole, who is a LEAP representative in the States, and I'm here speaking on behalf of LEAP. He used to say that, he would work undercover trying to find, people dealing and using drugs. And he said that he used to go to work every day really, eager to catch people, but after a while he used to go to work eager to actually work with the people that were using and selling the drugs, because he found them to be better than the people that he was working with as cops. And I kind of found that after a while too, that was, it was the hypocrisy of the law, it was the hypocrisy of the people enforcing the law, and it was the injustices and inhumaneness that really drove me to say, look, we've got to change this. We've got to take a different approach towards this issue. So that's why I'm here today.
So the title of the panel was from medical to recreational, the road to regulation, and one of the things I wanted to focus on was how we can move forward in regulating psychoactive substances, whether they be something like cannabis, or how we can change our approach around something like the opiates, or like ice, which is certainly on Victoria's lips at the moment. However, there has been a lot happening in the past month in Victoria, in particular around pill testing services, with the death of a young lady at Stereosonic in Sydney. It's catalysed calls for those pill testing services, and it looks like they might get up. But there's also been a bill introduced into Victoria which will increase sentences around people that use all drugs, but the excuse is ice. And I was wondering if, Fiona, you could tell us a little bit about that bill, because this has been very recent. In the past 3 weeks, it's sort of come up.
Yeah, thanks, Nick. It is, it's very disappointing that this bill has come up, and the bill does two things. The first section is to increase penalties for any drug supply or even drug possession around schools. So if you are closer than 500 metres to a school and you possess drugs or you're supplying drugs, not to children necessarily, just to anyone, you face a 25 years imprisonment. It's quite extraordinary. The second part of the bill, which I think is equal, well, it's probably worse. It's about the possession or distribution of documentation or material about the cultivation or manufacturing of all illicit substances. So, get off that home and garden site where it teaches you how to grow poppies, because that will be breaking the law. So this bill's coming up this week. The government, it's just it never ceases to amaze me how stupid they are with drugs. They said that this was about ice. Of course, it's not just about ice. They're covering all substances, and they probably could have worked out a way of carving out ice if that's what they wanted. But secondly, the police minister said, we can't arrest this mantra, we can't arrest our way out of this drug war, this drug problem. So we're going to introduce new offences and higher penalties. It was just such. I don't even know how he could see how misled he is and how misleading that is. So that's coming up for debate this week. I would encourage all of you to, if you could, to send a quick note to members of the Legislative Council, to my council. Don't need to write to me. I'm pretty good on this. But But if you wouldn't mind writing to my colleagues, I'd certainly suggest Mary Wooldridge and Ed O'Donoghue. Ed O'Donoghue is the police spokesperson for the Liberal Party, and Mary is the health spokesperson. It would be great for them to hear from people who oppose this bill.
And there's only 3 sitting days left of Parliament. Is it likely to pass before Christmas? Do you know this, or is this too difficult a question?
No, it's hard to say. It's on the list, but the Port of Melbourne's on the list. And so they want to get that sale of the Port of Melbourne or the lease of the Port of Melbourne through. That will take up considerable debate time. And in actual fact, there's only 2 days where they can put this bill in. Myself and the Greens will do whatever we can to stop the bill going through, whether that... learned a lot in the Safe Access Zone bill the other week about filibustering, so I think I may be doing a lot of talking about drugs this week, if it does come up, to try and stop it from actually making its whole way through. But we're also going to try and refer it to a committee. We'll try everything that we can. There is a lot of concern about this bill privately from government members, from myself. And I think even the Coalition has got problems with it because it's unenforceable. It doesn't work, particularly the documentation and publication area, and it's and most of the bill is already in the bill, so it's doubling up on stuff that's already there. So it's not really doing anything. It's just being seen to do something.
If I could just go a little bit further than that, Fiona called them stupid, the laws. There's no doubt about that. But they're also evil. They're draconian laws. It's an absolute outrage that the politicians that put these laws up, namely the Liberal and the Labor Party, pass them to appear to be hard on drugs for their own electoral advantage. It is an obscenity that politicians in this day and age can still do the same drum beating on a bill that, again, was by subterfuge attempting to attack the ice problem in Victoria, but in actual fact tightens the ratchet on the selling of marijuana as well, but also, and this is just a bridge too far, on the actual possession of information about how to grow cannabis. We've lived in a country, Australia, where we've had freedoms to possess and freedom of speech to possess information and pass it on. Now, this government is winding this back, and it really is something, as Fiona says, that I think people should protest. They should certainly write to their parliamentarians en masse. And we're trying to get a petition together. Nick has done some fantastic work on the website trying to publicise the issue, but this is the sort of thing that if good people don't do anything, these laws pass by default.
And just to clarify again, it's your upper house members of the Legislative Council, as it has already passed through the lower house, the Legislative Assembly. So you can find on the Victorian Parliament website links to find your local member if you're not aware of who they are. But this also, with this law around the banning of information, this comes at a time when we've had such good progress around medical cannabis in Australia, or seemingly good progress around medical cannabis. And one of the things that has driven that is people disobeying the laws and creating their own tinctures and creating their growing plants at home, having that information to grow those things and create those medical supplies at home, which seems like that law will directly affect those people at a time when we're slightly liberalising medical cannabis. There is a line between medical and recreational, but it seems a slippery one sometimes as well. And I was wondering if each of our panel guests could speak to that. Where is the line between something being for recreational use and for medical use? Eric, would you like to begin?
Well, many people believe that all use of cannabis is medicinal in some regard. Even if it's just to relax, well, that has some medicinal benefit for you. So it is a kind of grey area. Where is that border? But I would say that when people are allowed to grow cannabis themselves, it has a therapeutic advantage for them because they're in contact with nature. Perhaps they have MS or some debilitating disease, and they really don't have much to do. You know, they're unable to leave their house, some of them, but if they've got a little garden of marijuana to tend, it focuses their energy, it gives them some kind of creative direction in their life, and it gives them pleasure, not just the smoking of the plant or the use of it in whatever way they ingest it, but the actual growing and the cultivation of it. So to restrict the information around how to grow marijuana or other plants as well has that other detrimental effect of distancing people from nature and from the sources of their own medicine. Because if somebody can sidestep the pharmaceutical companies, not only is that a cost saving for that person and for the state, the health service, it's also a more natural way for them to medicate. You know, it's preferable to use botanical remedies to pharmaceutical remedies. If it's possible to use a botanical remedy, then do so. And the information to be able to create those plant medicines must be freely available.
Yeah, it's always intrigued me a bit, the medicalisation and that you can be prescribed certain drugs and that's okay, but if you use a few of the other illicit drugs that you're a criminal. I just find it eternally frustrating that we can't make progress on this. And at the moment, I'm just doing heaps of work writing reports for people who, because of their drug use, who've got into trouble with the law and they're going to court all before Christmas. And they're just drug users. They're not criminal people. And also what I'm finding too with the criminalisation issue is that with trying to tighten up the violent offenders on parole, you know, not getting parole, pulling people's bail, it's the drug users that are being affected. I don't know what's happening to the sex offenders and the violent offenders, but what I'm seeing in my work is that drug users who are notoriously late to appointments or might miss appointments, they're the ones being breached. So, yeah, there's a lot I don't understand.
There's a lot I don't understand either, Helen, about the drug laws. I mean, how could it come to this? As the documentary pointed out, the fact that cannabis has been used for 4,000 years as a medicinal compound, and as was said previously, it's also used as a recreational relaxant. The line between there's a medicinal purpose and a recreational, to me, has always been blurred as well. It again is one of the ironies of the debate that the United Nations 61 Convention on Drugs basically lists marijuana as having no therapeutic value. I mean, what bunkum, what ridiculous statement is that to be put in a United Nations Convention? Again, and we got the history there. It was impacted by the American policy, probably on some sort of Puritan evangelistic quest to stop us having a good time when it feels good. But look, the end of the day, I think the medical marijuana debate is a bit of a misnomer. Of course it should be able to be used for medical purposes. The danger I see in this, though, is the pharmaceutical industries and big business getting involved in the production of marijuana, as opposed to perhaps moving into allowing people to grow their own plants. The reform movement is really to liberate this plant so it can be grown in our back gardens. If it wants to be sold commercially through other outlets, again, so be it, even pharmacies. I have no objection to that. But at the end of the day, what we're fighting for as a reform movement is the right to be able to grow this herb for our self-medication, for our self-medicalised reasons, or for recreational.
I think, I agree with all the previous speakers. It does seem that the path for cannabis, as we've seen historically in other jurisdictions, has been the medicinal cannabis path that has then led on to the fact that what you call medicinal and may also be recreational. So we're starting to see a lot of changes. We've already seen 3 states in the US, and we're seeing another 3 in the next 12 months move on to regulating recreational sale or regulating cannabis altogether. So in Australia, I think it is a path that we probably have to go down. It would be great if we could speed it up and look at the evidence from other jurisdictions. I believe the medical cannabis legislation will be tabled next week in Victoria. The federal government tried to sort of say, states, don't do anything, we'll look after it all. And Susan Ley, the health minister, came out with a statement to that end last week. I was pleased that the Daniel Andrews government has chosen to ignore that and is going to continue on doing their own work here. We're setting up the first grow. They're already planning the first grow for medicinal. I think there will be a lot of amendment. We'll probably want to change the bill some way, but it is a step in the right direction. I know it's not what we all want, but it's a good start. And if we can start seeing it being available in a regulated way, and it doesn't scare the horses, and people aren't, turning into reefer madness frenzy, and I hope that this will take us one step further to being braver with our drug policies around general use.
This isn't an area that I'm all that, knowledgeable about. I guess I'm more of an observer of process rather than content, and I do take Eric's point, which is quite important. I think that we are all different, and we use drugs for different reasons, and they are functional. And I think that that's what we need to acknowledge, is that if it does provide a medicinal purpose, then great. Then we should use it for that purpose, as long as people can get access to it, and the community's comfortable with that. Then that's fine. What I find intriguing is that the Premier can have his arms around a little child who's having multiple epileptic fits and say we need to give this person medical cannabis, and then say a few weeks later that we need to keep drugs away from kids at schools by introducing those laws. So the political purpose obviously is opportunism, and the recent inquiry in Victoria again is a good example of that, about medical cannabis, that they would only inquire into its use in exceptional circumstances. But I guess time time does or has taught me that there has been change. I remember Ethan Nadelman came out to Australia in 2010 and he talked about the huge changes that were going on, particularly in the States, and the propositions that were being put up and the balloting process and how that was going to change cannabis law in the States. And that's come true. I think the process here is slowly changing, and I think that we're just starting to recognise the potential for cannabis for its therapeutic uses across a range of issues, and I think that that's something we need to keep exploring, but also allow people to use it if they just want to relax, relieve some anxiety, or just get some pleasure out of it.
In less than 6 months' time, the UN General Assembly Special Session UN will be meeting to discuss the international treaties which currently hold all member states captive, if that's the right word, to global prohibition. This is happening in April, and it is likely that the treaties will be relaxed, allowing member states to experiment with different kinds of regulation. Of course, we've already seen the United States begin down that path. Uruguay has also begun down that path. Netherlands for 40, 50 years has been down that path. But and Portugal, of course. But each state, each country has its own version of how to regulate. And what I'm curious about, I think Australia has a different way of approaching things, as every country does. And what I'm curious about is the panelists' thoughts on how we could regulate not just a psychoactive substance like cannabis, but even something like MDMA, which is our second favourite illicit drug after cannabis, and even other drugs like ice and like heroin. How can we regulate these things? Do we need to regulate them in a different manner for each one? Do we have some ideas from the panellists? Anyone can pick up.
I'll start. I think certainly if we wanted to make drugs safe, we'd legalise and regulate them. If we wanted to reduce harm, we would legalise and regulate all drugs. But looking at this on a step by step, I think certainly looking at Portugal and just decriminalising possession and use has had an outstanding result in harm minimisation in that country. And I think that would be one step. Certainly, I think MDMA and cannabis are also kind of, well, I wish they were low-hanging fruit, but they are two substances that have been well researched, that we understand the harm or lack thereof of consuming those products. So you could almost immediately make some way to regulate and tax and legalise those two substances. And I mean, that debate's been going on for years. I mean, Professor Pennington probably came out last century suggesting that MDMA and cannabis be legalised and regulated. I would love to see that happen. I'm not sure that Australia is going to be the first place to do it, though.
Maybe if politicians aren't motivated by the well-being of human beings as a concern, then I'm no economist, but maybe we could appeal to them on an economic level in terms of the money we're spending locking people up for drug-related crime. 100,000 per person per year is just a ridiculous waste of money. Most people come out worse than when they went in. You don't learn much in the way of skills in there. So, maybe that argument's the way to approach them. What do you think, Fiona?
So can I just quickly respond to that? Because the committee, we've got this wide-ranging inquiry into drugs in Victoria about to start next year. And it's probably one of the more conservative groups of MPs. In fact, it probably is the most conservative group of MPs you could have on a committee. And I think that's good, because I want this inquiry to convince the Conservatives. And if we can convince the Conservatives, then we will achieve drug law reform, but we sort of have to start with the hardest first. And having those Conservatives, and maybe, and certainly maybe looking at it from an economic perspective will be will be one of those very strong arguments, and I know Dr. Alex Wodak consistently says that too.
Look, just a quick comment. I guess, one of the things that's always brought up when we talk about changing the legal status of illicit drugs is the concerns over alcohol, and 3 areas that we need to be mindful of if we're going to talk about legalising or having a system where we get access to illicit drugs, currently illicit drugs, is that there's 3 aspects that we need to be mindful of: the marketing, the access and the pricing. So we need to look at those 3 aspects, because that's constant criticism of the alcohol industry, is those 3 things. And there's very little control over the alcohol industry in this state when it comes to those. They continually breach guidelines, their own guidelines, they continually breach media. They're continually pushing the boundaries when it comes to accessibility and pricing and marketing. So if we're going to look at a system of legalising illicit drugs, then we need to focus on those 3 issues. The other aspect of this that we need to be mindful of, and it's an area that we really haven't explored but we need to keep highlighting, is that the current prohibition provides funds to criminal groups to do lots and lots of other unlawful activities. And that was again highlighted last week when we had a series of shootings around Melbourne at nightclubs over the distribution of illicit drugs through security system. So we need to keep highlighting this, because we need to ensure that we that we get across a message that the whole community is at risk. And I think this is quite important. On the other side of that, if I could just quickly say that most people in the room would be aware that I guess the converse of that's happened over the last couple of years with changes in terms of drugs and driving legislation. So what happens now is that if you're pulled over by the police and you're drug tested, you can actually be charged with only having a minute trace of a drug in your system, not even being affected by the drug. And these tactics are designed to, I guess, demonstrate that the whole community is at risk from illicit drugs, because look at all the people that are drug driving. Even though those people don't put the public at risk, the message is that, there are a lot of people out there driving on drugs, which is a false message, right? It is quite disingenuous to say that that's happening. So, and again, they're targeting dance parties, festivals, rave parties with that legislation to demonstrate the risk with illicit drugs. So I guess we need to be very mindful of the issues, particularly in terms of pricing, access and marketing, if we're talking about a deregulated or legalised system. But also we need to ensure that we also kind of attack and raise our concerns about legislation which is purely net widening exercises. Yeah.
Just to take up a point about the legalisation of what it means, we're talking about the legal supply. So you need to have supply chains in place, like alcohol and tobacco. What that creates the opportunity for, as Helen said, is to legally tax these products, because we've got models in Portugal and in fact the Netherlands where supply is still illegal, and it's got problematic. The reason for that is pure and simple. Those bloody UN conventions that force governments around the world to criminalise this behaviour do not allow the legal supply of illicit or so-called recreational drugs. So as we move forward, we need to look at these models. Certainly for ecstasy, if it was sold in pharmacies and produced at pharmaceutical grade, it would be taxed, monitored, it would be much healthier. As far as marijuana, worth about $3 billion, you can do the figures. There's anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion tax without taxing the viability out of it. And there's certainly other drugs that we haven't touched on, but they're a little bit more sensitive, ice, but perhaps heroin, because of their addictive nature. They are certainly much more dangerous drugs. And this is the point about legislation and regulation. When we talk about trying to make these laws, how we're going to protect kids, how we're going to package these substances, how we're going to put doses on these substances. And this relates to marijuana through to ecstasy or even other pharmaceutical products that have strength on the packet. They're sealed to be tamper-proof so kids can't get to it. These are the sort of legislations that, or regulations that can be impacted if we bite the bullet on this issue and legalise the supply chain as well as the personal possession of.
Of course, there is a hard problem contained in that, and that is the problem that there's already a supply chain out there which is extensively resourced by hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars globally, and people generally want to keep the market that they already have contained. So there's a difficult problem because those involved with the black market don't want to lose their status quo. They don't want to lose their income. So there needs to be some kind of transitionary method to remove the black market. But not just, I mean, all the people in the black market aren't necessarily the kind of violent criminals that are buying guns and tanks in Mexico and waging war on the government. A lot of the people are your friends, people that you know that you go over to sit in their lounge room and buy something off them. So there's I think that's a hard problem, and it's not often addressed. It's an economic issue, and it's also tied up in. I suspect there's probably a lot of vested interests who don't want to let you know that it is a vested interest for them. Any ideas on how to tackle this particular difficult part of supply chains and legalising?
I could be facetious and say, look, we should have the same process that we do for refugees. We just give each person $5,000 and say, look, we buy you out. And that's not as absurd as it sounds, because the British Army actually suggested that in Afghanistan. The British Army suggested that they buy out the Afghanistani poppy fields. Yeah, because they acknowledged that they weren't ever going to destroy the poppy fields. So they said, let's face it, we've got poppy fields in Australia, we've got poppy fields in Tasmania, we've got them in Victoria.
First harvest was this month, actually.
Yeah, so. Yep. It's a very good drug, and so look, you're right. And I do take your point, Nick. It is important to be aware that, lots of people, have their own supply chain, and they do it because, they want to supply their friends or use themselves. So, so as far as the supply chain is concerned, it's extremely complex. When you've got crystal meth being manufactured in China in an environment where there's a lot of corruption, and they're getting a lot of their supplies from, places where, there's manufacturing going on at the local level, and there's officials being paid off, and, it's easy to say, well, we should have a system that, where we just supply it ourselves or manufacture it ourselves. It's a multi-billion-dollar international business. So, yeah, there's going to be lots of challenges. But let's start off, as has already been pointed out by Greg and others. Let's look at some low-hanging fruit. Let's look at some systems, and let's let those systems work and progress from there. And simple things like providing heroin to long-term, people who've got problematic heroin use. Look at what they're doing in Switzerland. They did it in the UK, and it worked well. Let's look at some approaches like that. It's going to be challenging. There's going to be some difficulties, but we can do it. We've tried it in the past. Maybe it's time again to raise the possibility of a heroin prescribing program.
I think that's a great idea, Greg, and I think when we tried to put up a heroin trial in the 90s in the ACT, we were knocked down by the Americans saying they wouldn't buy our poppies if we did that, and they'd knock out our just fledgling but very good opium crops here. So, but the times have changed enormously, and I don't think you'd get the same response from the US government today if we were to set up a heroin trial in Victoria. And the results of Switzerland and the results of the UK trials have just been wonderful. I mean, they stop people dying. They stop people breaking into houses. They stop people having to, you know, sit in a public toilet and hit up. And they have been remarkably successful. But I think my point is that America's not going to have the same response now than they did 10 years ago when we first raised this.
I wish I could be as optimistic in that analysis, but again, I've watched this debate like a pendulum swing, and Fiona's exactly right. In the late 90s, there was going to be a heroin trial. The International Narcotics Board, powered with enforcing the United Nations Convention, did actually visit Canberra and, Fiona says, threaten the viability of our poppy industry. But look, here's the numbers on this thing. If we medicalise heroin addiction, I was a heroin addict myself many years ago, and if I could go to a doctor, get a prescription for heroin to stabilise me and allow me to continue in employment, it would have done a couple of things. It would have allowed my health to avoid many of the health consequences. It would have allowed me to avoid the legal consequences. But more importantly for society itself, it would have stopped dead in its tracks the large business criminal organisations that make massive amounts of money on the backs of addicts. And here's the thing about your heroin and your amphetamine, your ice markets. They're largely fuelled, 80% on some estimates, 70 to 80%, by addicts, hapless addicts that have no choice except to use this substance. Now, if they could quite simply go into a doctor, declare themselves with their addiction problem, seek treatment, and then be prescribed a medical grade heroin or in fact ice or an amphetamine substitute to stabilise them and allow them to seek treatment, it again would allow society at large to benefit from the criminal activities of these hapless bastards, of which I was once one. And if I could allow Helen, not that she's a hapless bastard, but suffered the same fate with her addictions, the benefits to the Australian society would be enormous. And it's a policy that we need to, face head-on as adults in this day and age, knowing now what we do know about the nature of addiction and the drugs and, human behaviour.
Look, I don't know much about trying to stop the black market, because in my experience of dealing with dealers with a gun in their hand, they're not very easy to negotiate with. So I don't know, $5,000 I don't think could cut it. But I look around here and I think we're preaching to the converted here. I guess that all of us in the room understand this issue. And I was in a theatre group for years, and we did performances based on our drug using and prison experiences. And again, no MPs came to our performances. So it was community sector people and people who actually understand the issue. So I've got a bit of legislation, Fiona, and I think you're right in terms of we have to get the most conservative people to change their view on this. We do have to deal with those people. And I suggested on a panel recently that I think a good idea would be to legislate that all the normals out there, that's everyone else, should be made to go and visit someone in prison for an hour and talk to somebody who's in prison, given that most of the people in prison in Australia are drug users or have a drug use issue. And I just think in terms of trying to change attitudes, that would be incredibly, incredibly effective.
Either that'll give all the straights a joint. I mean,
I want to get away from generalities in the sequel and become more personal, because I think that has a more affecting, it has a greater effect on the viewer if people can be presented with a personal story that also conveys the same message. So one of the stars of the sequel will be Jose Mujica. I'm going to Uruguay in 2 weeks. I'm going to try and spend a full year there to get as much time as I can with him. For those of you who don't know, Jose Mujica is the former president of Uruguay. And he legalized cannabis there against the wishes of his own parliament. So he just basically superseded them, and he said, I know what is best for this country. And he just went ahead and legalized cannabis in order to separate the hard and soft drugs markets. And he's an exemplary person in terms of being a politician who's not there to, in some kind of vainglorious way. He's there as a statesman. He's there because he's showing true leadership. His background was that he was a guerrilla fighter for 14 years, I believe. He was captured. He was in prison for many years. 2 years he was held captive at the bottom of a watering trough. After he was released, he then campaigned and finally got into power himself. And his own personal experiences of intense suffering gave him a kind of a compassion for the people of his country that shines through in the way that he led that country during his term as president. And so I want to be speaking not just about the drugs issue and about the legalization of cannabis, but just what motivates him on a deeper level to give away 90% of his salary, to live in a tiny little farmhouse, to never move into the presidential palace, to never take all the trappings of power and material success. He drives around in a little VW Beetle. He never, you see these pictures of him with his security detail running next to this 1974 Volkswagen Beetle. And he didn't want to take the fancy car. He basically wanted to be a man of the people. So I'm going to be focusing on that and trying to present him as an example to other world leaders to say, this is what you should be doing. This is how you should be living. And his policies are basically just a continuation of his personality. So yeah, I think we need to find people to lead us who are like that. We have an unfortunate situation where we've created a system where we have leaders, and even those of us who don't want to be led, well, we've still got these people leading us. So let's try and get leaders who are actually worthy of those positions of power, because then we'll have decent policies that flow down from them. At the moment, politics is mostly a vanity project, and it's mostly a kind of intermarriage of corporate powers and policy making, so that it's beneficial for that tiny minority. We need to kind of get grassroots leaders in place, which is why I'm interviewing Fiona as well. She's going to be in the sequel, because I believe that she exemplifies that kind of thing too.
We're talking about all these policies, and as you said, we're preaching to the converted. We all know that this would help, and it would be amazing if we could decriminalise or even legalise all of these substances. We know what it does for society. It all works in theory, and it works in practice over in these countries like Portugal. So I'm wondering, how did Portugal get to that state? Because that's what we need to figure out, is how do we take the stepping stones to lead to decriminalisation and then further on to legalisation?
It's a really interesting question, and Portugal was actually, it was a fairly unique kind of series of events that led Portugal to this quite radical policy. But Portugal was facing it was getting hit very hard with heroin, and Portugal had sort of been a bit of a closed off country for many years before that. So they'd kind of missed the 70s. And so when heroin sort of started really emerging in Portugal, it made a really big impact. And the community, they just didn't know what to do, how to deal with this. They were jailing people. So some very brave politicians put up this proposal, and it got bipartisan support. And it has had bipartisan support since then. Something like, this ice epidemic that we're having, I mean, whether that's a tipping point for us to say, listen, we can't keep sending people to jail for using ice or sending people to jail for using drugs. We need to look at another program, and that $100,000 a year to send an ice addict to jail, we could probably spend $50,000 a year and provide treatment for that person. So whether ICE could be that tipping point, that would be great. But we're not going to have the same. It's a different situation here today than Portugal was, sadly.
Can I just make a comment too that I think Portugal was pretty much broke at that time, and they decided that we just can't keep pouring money into the criminal justice system. So they've they took a lot of money out of the criminal justice system and put it into education and hospitals, which made a lot of sense. So, and I think that was also an approach that we've got to think about as well. And I'm not sure if people are aware about the campaign Stop the Harm. I don't know whether you've seen that, but you can go online and support that. There's a petition to run through, it's conducted through International Drug Policy Consortium and other agencies, Transform, Release, etc., to take 10% out of the criminal justice system worldwide in the next 5 years to 2020. That's campaign basically saying we need to take 10% out of police, courts, prisons and put them into harm reduction, treatment, prevention programs. So you can go online and register for that. Yep.
Could I just proffer an answer to Dean's question there? It's a question that I've pondered at great depth and really, really vexes me. 40 years of prohibition and we're still upping the ratchet with this legislation in Victoria. Fiona's in an optimistic mood this afternoon. I appreciate that the ice epidemic...
Yeah, I haven't had much sleep. It's kind of, you know, I'm in a happy state.
Happy state. With the thought that the ice epidemic might be a catalyst for some sort of change in realisation. As the current legislation for the Victorian Parliament shows, that the politicians just have an incredible ability to further their own ends politically on this drug debate. Ever since Richard Nixon made a meal of it 30 years ago, it's been more of the same. So I've really pondered the question. The answer I've got is that we need $1 million, we need $2 million, we need $10 million to brand this issue. We are, as we look around the room, the converted, the people that know. And look, thank you so much for that illuminating documentary, because it really puts in context the nature of the problem, the propaganda that we're up, the force of the law that's backed these obscene laws. And they are obscene because they go to the heart of human rights, you know. John Stuart Mill, in sort of a treatise of government, has said that we do have the right to put in our body and our mind what we as individuals decide. Now, this new legislation, the Victorian Parliament, is actually now saying that the publication of information is an offence of strict liability. So, look, we are absolutely up against this. So this is, again, the thinking and the reasoning behind this group, Drug Policy Australia, that is an advocacy-only charity. It's a fully tax-deductible charity, and it's an organisation that, if I'm right, that if there are good people out there, like the people in this room, that either have suffered at the hands of the prohibition or know people and have family members or friends that have suffered at this obscene prohibition, that we'll get together, we'll put our money together, we'll be professional, we'll get a message out, and then it's up to good people, and these politicians, they're not, you know, prone to reason, but they are also a victim of community attitude. So the battle is hearts and minds.
Hi, Ash is my name. I'm a committee member of the Drug Law Reform Party and contributor to the In Psychedelia radio show. Now, the question for the panel is, what else can we do? I'm calling Talkback. I speak to everyone that I find. I go out and chat to people at festivals, at their camps. What other sort of blank spots are there that you guys think that we could, us, the people in the room that are willing to talk about these issues, where else can we put that energy that you think will get good bang for buck?
Certainly, let our politicians know. Let our politicians know that, you know, because they're hearing from Drug Free Australia, they're hearing from a whole bunch of sort of, you know, old-fashioned temperance movements. They're not hearing, and they're hearing about the disasters of ice and the, you know, the terrible things that are ravaging our community because of drugs. They're not hearing the stories of people who use drugs and maintain jobs and, you know, the 99% of us who use drugs. They're not hearing those stories. So I think you need to be telling your stories. And as I said before, I mean, if you could write to members of the Legislative Council this week saying how much you oppose these laws, that would be helpful. Next year, I hope hundreds of people send in submissions to the drugs inquiry and talk about their personal experiences. They need to hear the other stories. At the moment, they're only hearing the stories that the tabloid press are giving them. That, you know, and the plague of ICE and things like that. So they need to hear other stories.
Yeah, it's frustrating though, because I listened to Ken Lay recently on TV talking about the ice epidemic, and if you look back about 20 years, you would have heard the same commentary on TV about the heroin epidemic, you know, and people believe this stuff. So I don't know how you can change community attitudes when you've got people at that level repeating this, you know, these terrible epidemics we supposedly have here.
I actually think this is about the third ice epidemic we've had. I remember ice going back to the mid-90s. But I think sometimes, you know, that those types of alarmist statements can be a bit of a foot in the door. And you know, I think we need to first of all be part of the debate, but also think we need to ensure that we bring others into the debate and make it meaningful and personalise it for people. And I think, you know, as a parent, and there are lots and lots of parents out there, I think our messages, we need to ensure that we engage those people who probably don't like drugs, you know, for whatever reason, because of, you know, all the stereotypical reasons. But they also don't like the idea that, you know, their son or daughter might get caught by the police smoking a joint and having a record, or a caution that might stop them getting work or travelling overseas, or, you know, or they might get interrogated by the police, you know, and the sorts of laws that we're seeing now that are being proposed are a good way of raising people's concerns about not just privacy, because, you know, I'm not even sure what privacy means, but what I know is that if my son's looking at something on the computer and it's got, you know, information about growing weed or whatever, and he downloads that, or he wants it for a school, you know, assignment, or, you know, some other reason or whatever, he might want to grow weed. I don't know. Yeah, I might tell you which school he goes. I might tell you which school he goes to. But look, that's what we've got to do. We've got to ensure that people out there are aware that these laws have massive implications for them. You know, for them, they are at risk. So that's what I think we need to ensure that message gets across.
Can I just mention another terrible thing that's happened recently is that Department of Health and Human Services apparently have introduced, I don't know what you call it, it's not legislation probably, but whatever it is, that if you're an addict and you've had your child removed because of your drug addicted behaviour, whatever that is, because they think we're all morons, that you only have 12 months and to rehabilitate yourself, and your child's gone forever. So, I mean, you know.
I was a part of the inquiry that looked into that, and we wrote a dissenting report on that. But yes, it's absolutely right. Helen's right that they're now saying that children can be permanently taken away from parents who don't rehabilitate within the certain period. What they forget to mention is that it's really hard for those parents to get into treatments and treatment programs and effective treatment programs, and you know, treatment programs aren't snappy, quick things either. You know, these things take time, and we heard from so many people opposing that. Sadly, the government has allowed the department to stomp on them and let it go through, but it will be reviewed in 6 months.
And the previous government, state government, did a massive recommissioning of drug and alcohol services, which, and the legacy of that now is basically it's very, very difficult for people to get into treatment, purely as a cost-cutting exercise. You know, we had over 100 contracts with alcohol and drug services, agencies, and it's, you know, now down to about a dozen, and they've just taken what was a system built for the consumer, and it's now a system built for the provider, basically. So it's it's a difficult system to get into in terms of treatment.
The answer to what we can actually do, Look, Fiona was right. Submit to the inquiries when they come up, and I've got to commend Fiona for getting that drugs inquiry up. It is a biggie. It's a state government, the first one in Australia, actually looking into a very wide range areas of the illicit drug and, in fact, illicit drugs. It's the way that the Portugal legislation started with a very similar inquiry into drug use in that country. So this thing can have legs. I think there's another option federally, because this is a national Australia problem, a problem that affects Australia. A royal commission, I believe, needs to be called as a matter of urgency in this drug problem in terms of the social, economic and human health costs of this prohibition. And that's, again, a slow but sure something. The other thing in terms of optimism, and I'm not over-optimistic in this debate because, as I say, I just see it being more of the same for years. I have seen a change in some of the media, the Age newspaper, the Herald Sun newspaper, putting dissenting views in about the last 6 or 9 months, maybe 12 months. It's happening because America has legalised marijuana. So, you know, the mantra that, you know, you're soft on drugs, this sort of abuse, vilification of illicit drug use and drug users is beginning to abate. So what we can do is, and this sounds lame, but it's not, it adds to the voices and the noise, talkback radio. You know, it's probably not, you know, everyone's cup of tea, but I know Ash personally has been on a couple of interviews with John Fane and done a great job of putting an alternative point of view. Hey, look, I use drugs, you know, I'm not some, you know, adult ice addict or whatever the case may be. I've used ecstasy, I used it at a weekend and I had a good time. So we do need to come out with our stories personally, I think, and that's where Helen is particularly brave with her book about our own stories. But we need to take the intellectual high ground and argue in the media and in other areas. And I'll just leave one last concrete thought for action and change here. I think that the marijuana laws, recreational marijuana laws, are a long way away. I don't see any glimmer of hope, and the legislation in Victoria tightening that ratchet up for cultivating, the information on cultivating. I think the medical marijuana debate probably doesn't help a lot because, you know, it may give some respectability to marijuana as a medical industry, but it also gives it, ooh, it's medical, you've got to be sick to be using marijuana. So there's certain subliminal messages in this medical marijuana that I think can be a danger to the movement. So in a concrete fashion of what I'm pursuing in the next year is to try and organise a plebiscite for recreational marijuana. Now, if there was a plebiscite, I think it's a no-brainer that it would get across the line. And this would have to be a federal plebiscite on the specific question of the legality or Australians' right to use recreational marijuana. There's been about 5 instances federally of plebiscites being done on various issues. The national anthem was one, would you believe? It was slated by our last Prime Minister, thank God. That you could have one on gay marriage. Gay marriage is certainly an issue of human rights, but nothing of the order of the marijuana prohibition, which affects 2 million Australians every year that break the law. Their families and friends know. So there's more than, maybe 10 million Australians that have a positive attitude to not persecuting and prosecuting the people that use marijuana. So a plebiscite would at least give the politicians, because they're the bloody problem, it would give them the courage to stand up and say, hey, there is. Yes, with present company excluded, because we do have an exceptional politician to my right, or perhaps my left. The answer is a plebiscite and public opinion to sway those politicians.